Hello, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. The goal for a lot of people in life is rather simple. Get married and have children. And yet, there are more and more younger people these days who seem to be afraid of doing either option, especially the having kids part. They will say it's not a good time to have kids. And a quick look at the news these days might give you the impression that, yeah, now is a terrible time to have children. But Griffin Gooch, a Gen Z theologian and expectant father, looks at the same news and says, there is never a good time to have children, and you should have children anyway. He explained his position this way in a recent essay. Quote, "The authors of Scripture wrote about children as if they were a blessing, an inherent good. So even if this world is marred and drenched in a horrible amount of bad, bringing something good into the world isn't going to increase its bad. It can't." Unquote. So for this episode, I chat with Griffin Gooch about why Gen Z and everyone else should have kids. A little bit about Griffin. He is a theologian, a writer, and also a professor at a college in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He also happens to be a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary and is currently getting his PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He's written widely beyond his Substack, also for Christianity Today, Mere Orthodoxy, Inkwell, Christ and Pop Culture, and Front Porch Republic, and many more. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Griffin Gooch. Well, Griffin, thanks for being on the podcast. I wanted to start things out by just getting to know a little bit about you, kind of your faith background and, you know, what you do and all of that.
Yeah, so I am currently an almost fully trained theologian, so I have about a year left on my dissertation at University of Aberdeen. So as soon as that's done, which should be done, I think, next May, I will be I'll officially be a theologian. But yeah, I've been following Jesus for 10 years now. I started following Jesus like right as I started college. Actually, I was studying philosophy at a secular university, and I became a Christian in that environment, which was just kind of interesting to think about. And yeah, ever since then, I just wanted to like do something honorable toward God with whatever giftings that I had. And so at first I tried to be a worship leader, but then I strained my vocal cords beyond repair while I was working at a church out in Los Angeles. And then I decided to switch gears and then become a theologian, which is what I've been doing for the past, I think 5 years now, all in all. And so, yeah, that brings me to where I am today. I'm still in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and yeah, heavily involved in the local church and just trying to serve God through writing and teaching and yeah, things along those lines.
So I'm kind of assuming, like growing up, your parents and things didn't have a church background.
There's the term that everybody uses where it's like Christmas Easters,
Easter, yep.
Creasters.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was like. I remember there were a few seasons here and there where we were like trying to go more consistently, but no, it didn't really start kicking in until I was in college.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, cool. You know, I think the reason I wanted to, I've been trying to find a way to get you on the podcast for a while now, but I think you wrote a really kind of cool article, maybe just about a week ago, basically on the recent news that you're going to be a dad later this year. That's with the title, Having Kids when there's never a good time to have kids. And
Yeah.
it kind of talks about, and we hear this a lot in the news these days, that there seem to be, especially among younger people, this fear of having kids, but that, why do I want to bring a kid into this world is kind of the thing that seems to come to fore. And so you
Yeah.
kind of spend a lot of that essay talking about that. Um, Maybe the first place I want to start is, what led you to write the article, besides knowing that you're going to be a dad?
Okay. Well, starting to write it was kind of interesting because over the past, I don't know, probably my wife and I have been married for like 5 years, and we've always been kind of like clear about our intentions, like, hey, we want to have kids one day. But we noticed that sometimes, we would have some friends, usually people who are outside of the church, they give these reactions like, are you are you sure you want to do that? Like, is this something that's actually going to be good for you or good for your future? Is it, sort of even just like implying that the idea of having kids is somehow selfish for the reason that's the general reason. There's some other reasons out there that I've heard, but the general reason is that the world is on a steep decline, and that if you do have kids within a generation, there's not going to be a world left for them to grow up into. And there's like various reasons for it. Lots of people cite climate change. That's probably the biggest one, I think. There was a survey that asked for people's different opinions for not having kids, and I believe climate change was the biggest tangible concern. And then beyond that, it was like politics, economic concerns, threats of war, things along those lines. And so just noticing constantly that so few people were excited to have kids. And then the weird aspect of seeing so many people being skeptical about it was actually like, I do a lot of research in the social sciences, and I have a book about happiness coming out. And so I did like a bunch of research on the psychology of happiness and like what actually leads to a good life. And one of the first ones is like, you'll just see this in every single book about happiness, because it really is one of the things that's makes you so happy is find a family, find friends, find close connections, and then just stay in that community for as long as you possibly can. I mean, there was this Harvard study of adult development, which, I mean, it lasted, well, it's still going on. It's been going on for 87 years straight. So they started this study with people who were attending Harvard and inner city kids at the same time, and it's been going on, I think 87, 88 years now at this point. And they were basically just trying to figure out like, what makes for a good life? What makes people happy? How do you actually, build a flourishing lifestyle? And the answer that they came into, it's so funny, but it's just get married, have kids, do things along those lines. And so there's this weird dichotomy between what our culture believes will make us happy, which is this sense of like security, of like, get a good job, get social status, get enough money, get like enough popularity or just resources, and just have as much of that as you possibly can. And also don't give yourself any constraints, like live as free from constraints as you possibly can. And it's just so interesting how different the cultural definition of like happiness and living a good life is actually different from social science, and then obviously from, biblical theology and along those lines. And so all those things kind of came together, and that's sort of what got me thinking about the article.
Why do you think that there is? I mean, it seems like, and I don't know, but it feels like there is almost a generational push against having kids, and sometimes going even farther against getting married, or to things to that extent. And the reason I say it appears that way, because maybe that's something that has always been there, but I don't know. I mean, growing up, and I'm an elder Gen Xer, no one was talking like that. And,
Yeah.
my generation was the one, we were fearful of nuclear war. And I don't think people were running around saying we weren't going to have kids, but it seems like that is more of a thing now.
Yeah.
Why do you think that
absolutely.
is?
That's such a good question. Well, so in the article, I was talking about these books that I was reading, which was, and these novels from like 18th century, 19th century. So you had like one from Dostoevsky, one from Steinbeck, and then I was just reading. Ernest Hemingway had this one it was about like the Spanish Civil War, which was like a horrible time to be alive in a sense of like, oh wow, there's so much war going on. You're living in this place where there's just bombs going off everywhere. You're living in constant threat of disaster. But there's this part where this woman is just asking him like, oh, are you worried that your wife will get pregnant or something like that? And he's basically just like, not really. It's not like my biggest concern, which is so enormously different from how we would be thinking about that nowadays. We would just immediately say like, oh, everything that you can do to possibly avoid having kids right now is what you should do. But and then also even just if you go back like even 30 years, like 80s or 90s movies and stuff, like, I can't think of a single reference in like any of these movies. I'm sure you could find one, but anytime that there's a baby, or a pregnancy, it's never like, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? Or oh, your life is going to be over. It's almost unanimously considered a blessing, something that's good, something that you should actually be proud of or happy of. And so that's really weird to think about, the fact that it was so normal and so just generally considered good. I mean, just 20, 30 years ago, but now it's just completely shifted. And I'm guessing the other big shifts that happened in this time frame, so we had a rapid advancement of informational technology. So obviously, like when the iPhone came out in 2007, that was like the biggest step forward in information traveling since the Gutenberg press in the 15th century, right? 16th century? One of those. I can't remember off the top of my head. And so when that happens, you start hearing all of the world's news all at once. It's in your pocket. It's inescapable. And so when you do hear the world's news, what it tends to sift to the top is the negative news, just because, it's part of like cognitive bias that human beings have, is like, we pay attention to negative news much more profoundly and strongly than positive news. It's just how we think for whatever reason. And so when you have all of these things kind of coalescing, like this rise of informational technology, all the world's bad news in your pocket all at once, it starts giving you like a rapid sense of things are doomed, things are not going in a good direction along those lines. So that's probably one pillar of it. And then also the other pillar I would say is like, whereas, my dad's generation, they thought of constraints as kind of a good thing. Like, you would view things like marriage as like, oh, this is just a good thing to do. Like, it's the right thing to do in a sense. There was almost like this moral duty about it. But nowadays, marriage, I mean, and it's been reimagined in these past, again, like 30 years now. But nowadays, marriage has been like sort of idealized as like a place for where you can just fulfill your pleasures or your desires. And even the way that Christians kind of talk about marriage sometimes too in the church, it's more like, oh, you get married and that's something that you can sort of just channel your sexual energy into or something along those lines. Like, it's not like hallowed as if it's like this beautiful, amazing mystery, like which is what Paul calls it. It's more of just seen as like, oh, it's just this thing that you do to like fulfill your desires, essentially. So it sort of instrumentalizes marriage and turns it into something slightly more profane than it actually should be considered. And so both of those things together, probably informational technology rising, and then just a total redefinition of ethics towards whatever fulfills yourself and whatever fulfills your pleasure.
You used something in the essay, and maybe it was in relation to a quote you had from Dostoevsky about people wanting a frictionless life. And when I thought about that, I read a lot of stuff by Andy Root, and then he also reads things that are related to Harmat Rosa and all that stuff.
Oh, wow.
And that got me thinking about all of that there is that desire for that having a child or getting married are things that are, well, let me say being married is not frictionless. You're dealing with another person, and that person is, and let's just say my husband can kind of tell me I'm not the nice, I can also be he loves me greatly, but also can think, who are you? Why you're bugging me? And so there's always that kind of sense of friction that is a part of life that I feel it sounds like, and what you're saying in the essay especially, is that people want to have this, or maybe are afraid of it because it's not frictionless. And so they kind of have this illusion that they can have a life that's frictionless. But it seems like if you have that, you're not going to have life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's one of those things that is really hard for us to discern because, I mean, again, I'm sorry, I have happiness just so much on my brain because I've just been studying it for years now. But we have this idea that like living a good life or finding happiness or true joy or something like that is not going to involve grief or negative emotions. Essentially, it's just going to be this nonstop rush of positive emotions. But and this is really interesting because this just came out in like 2026. It's like one of the most recent studies on happiness. They did this meta-analysis on different forms of happiness and different paradigms of happiness. And they found that people who define happiness as maximize pleasure and minimize pain, which is the Freudian pleasure principle, people who define happiness that way, which is hedonic happiness, they tend to be much more unhappy than people who can have a vision of happiness that allows them to be sad within it, which is kind of which I mean, it just goes so against like logic. You know, you would think that you would just want more pleasurable emotions, that you would just want to feel ecstatic all the time. But in reality, you need those negative emotions because they give your positive emotions something to compare themselves to. And so in a counterintuitive way, things like grief, things like sadness, things like, you know, even just having a moment to like cry or something like that, those things actually do lead to a better life than anything else. And so in the sense that, tying it back to the article, we have this fear of, if we bring a child into the world, they're going to face so many horrible things. They're going to have a really hard life. Things are just going to not go well for them in general. And because of that rationale, we tend to say, let's just not do that because they're going to have such a hard life. But in reality, the hardships that they will face, that all of us face, are actually going to lead us closer to a good life. You know, if you lived a frictionless life, if you never suffered, you would never realize your need for God. You would never really realize your need for transcendence. You would never realize that there's something else beyond this like temporal immanent frame. You would be kind of just stuck in your own devices essentially. And then that would not lead to a flourishing life. You know, like Jesus was talking about in talks about this in Luke 6, Matthew 23, but just, you know, saying like, woe to you who have everything you need. Okay. Woe to you who, you know, your stomach is full constantly. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who, are very obsessed with status building with other people. Because the more that you do those things, the more that you're actually distracting yourself from, you know, the reality that you need something beyond yourself, essentially. And so, yeah, in a roundabout way, we rationalize this idea of I'm not going to bring a child in the world because something bad could happen to them, when in reality, it is that friction that they face, it is that resistance that they face that does actually lead to a better life. Even though it's hard, and even though and it's not like, just to clarify, it's not like a stoic kind of, just suffer and get used to it, or like, just deal with this bad thing and then just, you know, suck it up or something like that. It's like suffer and feel it all the way, you know, like Jesus in Garden of Gethsemane, right? He was lamenting, crying, right? All of those things, he felt everything. So like, again, like Christian life isn't just like, get really used to the suffering and then move on. You know, it's metabolizing the suffering with God, you know.
Part of this is also because I think we see this especially in some surveys that, especially among Gen Z, that it's a generation that is far less religious really than past generations. That not having that kind of religious background allows you to think, why would you have a child, or why would you get married, and not understand kind of the religious background of those two experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a huge factor. I know that there's it's a little bit old now, so I'm not sure if the numbers need to be redone or anything like that. But I remember about 6 years ago, there was this big study about projections for, you know, who's going to have the most kids. And then by the year 2050, it was found that atheists were going to be in the vast minority by 2050 because so few of them were either having kids or planning on having kids. Whereas it looked like Christians and Muslims were going to be leading the charge in having kids. So like by the year 2050, they were basically saying in kind of a dark way, it was like, okay, well, it looks like atheists are going to kind of become slowly extinct because they're not procreating, they're not reproducing. Whereas Christians and Muslims seem to be doing that in insane numbers. And so I do think there's a huge religious gap in this scenario for sure. And I mean, part of the Christian faith, one of the things that I do talk about a lot in my personal work, because it's just a view that I really just dislike, but we lots of Christians do have kind of a doomerist mentality of like things are going to go to hell in a handbasket and things along those lines, being very pessimistic about the state of the world. And there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic about the state of the world. There are plenty of horrible, horrible things happening constantly. But at the same time, embedded within our faith is a hermeneutic of hope, just realizing that we can interpret everything around us as if we have hope, even if there's not even a logical reason to feel hopeful. We have an actual logical substantiation, a theological imperative to hope, even in times of dire circumstances. And so that's one of the things that religion, I think, in general, should help us prepare for, is just this idea that we need to hope, even in face of adversity, suffering, and perceived hopelessness. Therefore, having kids is not as scary as it might be for some other worldviews.
What do you think is kind of the Christian understanding, especially of having children? You kind of touch on that a little bit in talking about some of the history or some, especially in the Hebrew scripture, of people who were barren and how that was considered such a shame. And then kind of going through that, what has been, at least in your understanding and possibly in your study of what was kind of the biblical understanding of having children?
Yeah, so in biblical theology, building right off of Genesis, right? Mm-hmm. So in Genesis, God says, be fruitful and multiply. Mm-hmm. So for most of history, Christians have really taken that command very seriously and literally, and then talking about, how God will bless the offspring of Abraham and things along those lines. Especially for the Jewish people in the Old Testament, the idea that if you did have offspring, it would naturally be blessed because Yahweh, the God of Israel, said that he would bless that offspring. There is just a reality where they perceived, procreation, having children, as just a natural blessing. And so to be deprived of that, to become barren or to be unmarried or widowed or something without the chance of having a child was such a horrible detriment that it was like on par with the greatest injustice that could happen to a woman. And it was one of the reasons, procreation was so important in Old Testament theology. And again, I probably don't have time to talk about it, but anyway, in the New Testament, because of certain translations of Ephesians 5, people started kind of getting away from the idea of marriage as being like this holy mystery and started trying to hallow singleness, essentially. And so because of that, the whole beauty of procreation, the theological imperative of procreation kind of got lost a little bit in translation. But anyways, back in the Old Testament, it was such an important thing to have a child that there was a law essentially where, if a woman was married to a man and the man dies before they were able to procreate, the woman was supposed to marry that man's brother and on down the line until she was able to procreate. And this was just it sounds so strange to our culture now, just obviously. And it would be weird if we just tried to start that up again, right? But at the same time, there is something about that attests to the deep intrinsic beauty of having a child, of just making a baby. There's something so beautiful in it that God just blessed it throughout creation. He just wove it into the natural law of reality.
Yeah, and I think I remember, was it in the Old Testament, what they call the sin of onanism, Onan spilling
Genesis
his seed.
38.
Yeah. And that was considered a grave error to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great connection.
So one of the things I'm trying to figure out is how do you try to instill in people, especially in your generation, the importance of having children, the importance of being married. How do you get to that point in a society where does seem to be a lot of doomerism and just people not seeing a sense of hope?
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough question. It's not something that naturally comes very easily because, lots of people do struggle with it in many ways. I mean, obviously, it's much easier to kind of give the spiel when you're within a church environment where, you have more of like a theological imperative to, pursue procreation, essentially. But especially when it's outside of the church, I mean, for that, I would just probably just draw on, I mean, there's so much just secular research just about how, like the way that our news media is set up, the way that information is set up. I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we're so geared towards a negativity bias in a sense. So the reason why, like everybody that I know, essentially, maybe I don't know if this was as much for Gen X. I've heard varied things from Gen X, but for me, especially for millennials, we grew up with this natural assumption that the world was getting worse progressively, that everything was on a steep decline, that there was no, that we weren't actually moving towards something good, that the world had to get progressively worse. There was no idea of having hope, that if you had hope for the world, that you were just genuinely naive, essentially. But social scientists, I mean, you got like people, I don't really like these guys necessarily, like as people, but I respect them. But like Steven Pinker, who we got? I'm just looking around the room. We got Hans Rosling, Matt Ridley, people along these lines. They put together like a lot of research on this topic and found that like regardless of your points in history, you have this negative bias towards events, so that you tend to interpret everything as if it's going negatively. So this is called, the technical term for it is negativity bias, but some people call it the rose-colored lens syndrome, which I think is a better, it's kind of like a better way to illustrate it. But rose-colored lens syndrome is essentially this bias that we have to interpret yesterday as better than today, and then way better than tomorrow, essentially. So when we it's one of the reasons why, regardless of how old you are, you tend to interpret the times of your childhood as just better than now. Like it happens to me. It happens to me like constantly. I'm not even very old, but like, I just see like, oh, these kids these days are on TikTok and they're coming up with all this algo speak that I can't understand. And so it's like you just naturally interpret like, oh, things are worse now for this generation. It was so much better when I was a kid. But in reality, that is just the cognitive bias that human beings have for whatever reason. We just tend to interpret things in the past as if they were better than they are right now, and are better than, and much better than they will be in the future. And so we just naturally, for whatever reason, have a skepticism about the goodness of the future. And so due to that, we tend to minimize the potential for good. Even though good things happen to each and every one of us every day, we just tend to not actually notice them, realize them, or even just take a second to, stop and smell the roses or something like that, right? And so when I trying to explain this to somebody who might not have a religious framework, is just try to deal with it like that, in the sense of just saying, hey, you will live a good life if you get married, if you have children. It's like one of the most well-proven things in all of social sciences is just this idea that if you get married and have kids, you will live a really good life. Like that's essentially like an indisputable fact. Like some people will have a hard time, but the general trend is that if you do those things, you will flourish in a sense. And so I would probably just go in that direction, just saying like, hey, like there is so much tendency to look at things negatively, but if you do step out, choose to have optimism, choose to have hope in this situation, there's a good chance that things will turn out for good.
I think you bring up in the essay, especially how hard childbirth was maybe about a century ago. And I think you shared a statistic that in the 19th century, child mortality in the U.S. was at 462 or 463 deaths per 1,000 births. So we're basically saying about half of the kids, half the people who were born were going to die. And
which is insane.
According to most recent data now, it's 5.5 out of 1,000. That's a huge change. And I just find that interesting because it was worse, 100 to 150 years ago to have children. Most of those kids were not going to live. And we're not even talking about whether even the mother was going to live or not. Childbirth was risky. I mean, it still is risky, but it was very risky back then.
Oh my goodness.
And now it's not. I mean, it's not as
Yeah,
it's
nowhere
not
near as risky.
yeah, no. And, you know, there are other countries that are even better than the US when it comes to child mortality. But 5.5 is good. But I think
Yeah.
we don't
Yeah.
see that, or because we kind of live in this kind of the now, we don't understand the whole sweep of history of how rough it could be.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is, we weren't, none of us were alive back then. So
Of
if you're not
course.
really studying history, which is one of the things that, I mean, I teach church history. So that's one of the things that's really helped give me some perspective on this is like every day I'm like, oh my gosh, things were so difficult back then. There's just an insane amount of difficulty constantly. And so if you don't have a historical framework and if you're not just like casually looking along some of these, older documents, or if you're not just studying statistics, which none of those things are very common pastimes for Gen Z, especially. But yeah, if you're not doing any of those things, you would just interpret like those 5.5 out of 1,000, you would just say, oh, that's horrible. That's just an awful amount of deaths or something like that. But when you compare it to something, you're like, oh, obviously 5.5 is horrible. It's awful. But it's like, wow, that's statistically so much safer. But it's like you just need those older stats or something to compare the present to.
Do you think that having children, especially, is, I mean, that it does kind of lead to a sense of hope? And what I'm thinking about, and I have this thing, I'm not crazy about reading a lot of apocalyptic literature, but I kind of know about some of these things. So like I know
Okay.
about the novel Children of Men and the fact
Oh yeah,
that
yeah,
all of a sudden women can't have children, and basically society just goes to seed.
yeah,
Because in some ways there's this sense that we're dying. And so
yeah,
there's just no hope. And it seems to me that birth has something to say about hope, that even as with all the problems that are in the world, this thing can still happen. Life can still happen. That
yeah,
somehow God can still create this new life.
yeah. No, I think there's something very much to that. I mean, there's definitely like social scientific literature that talks about this emotion called awe, which is this feeling of your mind trying to accommodate itself to something mysterious or amazing, essentially. And one of the biggest ways that we experience awe is like witnessing the birth of a child. There's just something about it that's just inexplicably beautiful. And so there's definitely something to that. But even just from the theological perspective, there's something so strange and weird and beautiful about the fact that Jesus, God himself chose to actually come into the world through birth, essentially. There's so many different ways. He could have just descended from heaven, right?
Yep.
He could just be like, okay, well, I'm going to descend and then ascend later. It's so much easier that way. But there's something strangely weird and beautiful about the very fact that, in Genesis 3, when, it's talking about the bad things that are going to happen now as the result of the fall. It talks about how like, oh, this women will now experience suffering in childbirth. It's now going to be very painful, or that's essentially what's there. And then that's the first Adam, right? And then the last Adam, which is Christ, chooses to enter the world through
Same process.
birth, which is
Yeah.
amazing. Like it's
Mhm.
it's one of those things where Maximus the Confessor, the 6th century theologian, he was talking about that in one of his books, and I was just blown away by that, just thinking about how there is something actually theologically beautiful and significant about birth, just as it is. There's something about it that's just, and also I just like that also that we don't. I'm trying to articulate how beautiful and amazing it is, but I can't. Like, there's just not enough like language to describe what the process of it, and like it's still like a mystery in a sense. And there's something just beautiful in the sense that it's a mystery, and I just love that about it.
I'm curious, how does it feel for you personally now that you're going through this process of having a child, and what does that mean for you as a Christian?
Um, well, in one sense, I am. I am still a little bit scared just because I know, like, wow, I'm a bad sleeper in general. I'm chronic insomnia, and so I'm like, wow, it's gonna be pretty tough for the first like year, maybe more than that. Actually, maybe way longer than just a year. So there's like a part of me where I'm like, oh, this is going to be kind of nerve wracking, but at the same time, I mean, we spent this past weekend with we were watching our nieces and our nephews. They're like all under the age of 6, and I mean, it's tiring. It's crazy. But there's something so much, it's so much fun in a sense. Like you get to see the world through the lens of a child. Like they're mystified about the tiniest things and they're just blown away because they're experiencing most of the world for the same time. And so they're experiencing everything with like the height of emotion, right? Good and bad, you know? It's one of the, one of the reasons why it's like, they can literally be so happy about the smallest of things, but then the smallest of things can also just set them off and, you know, just they start crying just belligerently, right? And so the idea, just that the sense of just I'm so excited to just care for something else, you know. It's it seems like counterintuitive, but there's just something that's so life-giving about serving, you know, something that really cannot serve you back, right? It's a very self-sacrificial process. They can't really start doing much for you until they're much older, right? And so I'm as a Christian man, I'm very just excited about that. Just even just thinking about just how it's gonna spiritually form me, and yeah,
Well, I think it's interesting how you end the essay, because you talk about how you're thinking of maybe writing the great American novel, and
oh yeah,
you talk a little bit about, you know, you're thinking about, you know, would you ever become the generation, the Gen Z's Hemingway, and
yeah,
you talk a little bit about your a visit. You know, you're getting you and your wife go to the fertility clinic to get an ultrasound,
yeah,
and that kind of you see that or all of that, and you basically say all those fears, and because you also had a whole lot of fears, and that they were
yeah,
evaporated, and you say something that just kind of was stuck by me. It's like, it's hard to stay cynical when you see a baby's heartbeat.
yeah,
Could you kind of explain a little bit more about that? Because I think that was kind of
yeah,
a center part of that essay.
yeah. Um, well, so sadly, this was our third pregnancy, but you know we haven't had
Hmm.
any kids yet, and so it's been a very hard process of just trying to essentially get pregnant and then, you know, try to, you know, fight for a lasting and healthy pregnancy. And so we've been to through this process a lot of times before. And so we got to the clinic and, you know, it was the week mark where we were going to try to hear the heartbeat, which, you know, we had never heard before. And so there's this just deep fear. And I mean, we still have it, you know, even if we go to the doctor now, there's just this kind of like leftover trauma or anxiety from that experience. And so, you know, we go in there and we, you know, hear that we're about to start doing this. And just the second of seeing, I don't know, I've never experienced like any emotion on that caliber before in my life. But, you know, I feel like in my life, you know, we had like dogs and cats and stuff around, or like animals, and you would see like them give birth or something like that. And, you know, I've had some like friends or brothers and sisters who've, you know, had babies, but I've never been like close to it or around it or like deeply involved in it. But just to be there and just to actually witness it, it's like all of those anxieties that I might have had about having kids, you know, the anxiety about like, oh, what if I can't accomplish all the things that I'm supposed to do? Or like, what if I don't have time in my schedule to do the things that I'm supposed to? What if I can't like honor the things that God has called me to? All of that, all of those worries were just put immediately into perspective. And so any sort of cynicism that I might have had about like, oh, what if things don't go the way that they're supposed to? What if this gets in the way of other more important stuff? It's like that just completely evaporated. There was just, yeah, it was just none of that anymore. And so I don't know. I'm still trying to, I tried to talk about in that essay, but it's hard to articulate it. But, a lot of my friends who've been through similar experiences, they try to, describe it as well. And they struggle to find words for it either. But it's just something insurmountably beautiful.
In that moment, where did you think you saw God?
I mean, just like, we saw the ultrasound. And so I would just say, like, you see, it kind of looks like if you're at the hospital and you see that like heartbeat monitor, like the little beep, 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 just that, like the fact that there was motion there, I also teach like philosophy. And so there's like the thing about Aristotle where he thought about like God as if he was this unmoved mover, like he was the first cause of everything. And so thinking about like that heartbeat just actually not existing, 10 weeks before that, and then all of a sudden a cause came into being, something caused that, right? And so that was just, that's exactly where I saw it.
If you were talking to someone who is not in the church, but is around your age and is not sure about having children or getting married, how would you talk to them about this?
Oh man, I would probably talk to him a little bit along the same lines of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, like just trying to realize that there is a logical rationale to have hope. It's not something that's naive. It's not something that's dumb. It's not something that's stupid. And so I would kind of go in that direction a little bit. But then even beyond that, just, trying to just appeal to their subjective experience, just saying, hey, like this is something that is actually worthwhile. This is something that's beautiful. This is something that can actually change your life in the best possible way. And, you're probably assuming that the good life will come in other ways, it can, like in certain ways, like in certain unique circumstances, it can come in those kinds of ways. But, there's something about the simple beauty of just doing something along these lines that can actually really breathe life into your experience.
I think one of the things that is always important to remember, and I think when it's either having children or getting married, is the importance of realizing, one, that it's not all about you, but I think two is that it's not all on you. And there's something important about knowing that life, you don't have to go through life all on your own, or rely all on your own. And I kind of worry sometimes that younger generations feel that it's all on them and that there is no one there to help them. And I don't know, that's just something I think about.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that as well.
So where do you think the future will be, a few years from now for generations? Do you think that maybe that they will see some reason to have kids, or that it's a good time to have kids, even if the times aren't great? Which I think then means, can this generation find a sense of hope? Because that's kind of what we're talking about. Yeah.
I very much believe so, but I do think it's very contingent upon religiosity in general. I just, obviously, so the cultural icons and the models that are very praised right now in our culture are usually the people who are like celebrities or influencers on social media or something like that. And so even if you're not a Christian or something like that, you can see an influencer or a celebrity who is having a child and finding like fulfillment and joy through that. And you can be inspired towards that. You can say, oh, there is something joyful and beautiful about that. But like beyond that, I think it just really will require a return to religiosity in a sense. And I do believe that, lots of people do debate these. If you're on Substack a lot, there's a guy named Ryan Burge who does a lot of the statistics on these things.
Yes, I do.
So he's so he's generally more pessimistic about any sort of religious revivals or revivals in church attendance, where you have other people like Justin Brierley, who's much more optimistic about like a surprising rebirth and belief in God. And so there's definitely streams of difference in, what we think the future is going to hold. But I'm personally more optimistic about it. And it might not the difference is that it might not look like conventional church attendance did in like the 1960s or something like that. It might look just slightly different. It might look like small communities popping up here and there, things along those lines. But I'm generally hoping and believing that there is a return. There is going to be a return to spirituality and united around some sort of religion, ideally Christianity. But I do think there is going to be a move in that direction. And so any sort of like rise in people wanting to have kids, I do believe is going, because it can be inspired in small ways, like I was just saying with influencers. So, but that for a big like return to childbearing as like a good, joyful, happy blessing is going to require just a larger return to religiosity, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually talking a while back with a Lutheran pastor who does believe in some type of revival, but I think one of the things that he says is that it doesn't look like what we would expect a revival to look like. And I think you're basically saying the same thing, is that we think of either historically, going back to the Great Awakenings or something to that extent, or what church was like in the 1960s or 70s or something. But what a revival might look like in 2026 may look very different from what it did in 1966.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we might be missing what's happening, that it's not happening in the way that, there are these droves of people just all coming to church, but it might be in, as you said, in smaller groups that are happening.
Yeah.
That we are just not picking up yet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I can definitely see that as well. And that is kind of what I do see among a lot of people who are around my age, is more like, less like mega church focused and more like, hey, can we be attached to this church, but really be focused in this intentional small group, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the religiosity connection does matter, because I think it's the sense, as I said before, of hope. And I think one of the things that religion, especially Christianity, instills is a sense of hope, even beyond how things look in the world.
Yeah.
That when you don't have that, then you just kind of curve in, as Luther says. So you just curve in on yourself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So, well, if people want to know more, and you do have a really cool Substack, where should they go?
Well, yeah, the main thing that I'm active on is Substack. You can search Griffin Gooch or Reality Theology, and you can find that there. I'm also vaguely on Instagram here and there. You can just search my name and just find me on there. But yeah, that's pretty much the main places to find me.
Okay. Well, Griffin, thank you so much for this. This was great. Again, congratulations on the birth announcement, and blessings through this whole process. And I think you said it's a due date in November.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So blessings for that to happen, and that it happens smoothly. So, and I hope to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right.
I would love that, man. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
As usual, I will put the link to Griffin's article in the show notes. And I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts about the episode. Feel free to send me an email at churchinmaine@substack.com. If you want to learn more about the podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, check me out at churchandmaine, all one word, .org. And you can also check churchandmaine.substack.com to read related articles. I'm actually working on one right now that will be about the need for the local church. You can also listen to episodes of Church in Maine. I do put some of those episodes on my Substack that usually appears about a week after it goes live on the main website. You can also become a paid subscriber of the Substack. I don't put anything behind the paywall, but if you would like to support me financially, you can do that. It is $5 a month or $60 a year on Substack. And to do that, go to churchinmaine.substack.com. Otherwise, I hope that you will subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app and to leave a rating or review. When you do that, that actually helps others find the podcast. And I also hope that you will consider sharing this podcast with others. That's going to be it for this episode of Church in Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Again, thank you so much for listening. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.